Matthew quotes Hosea as a prophecy about Jesus. But Hosea was not talking about Jesus. He was talking about Israel, a whole nation, called out of Egypt by God centuries earlier, back when Moses was still alive to lead them. So why does Matthew take a sentence about Israel's past and apply it to a child fleeing from Herod? That is not a Bible mistake. It is not Matthew forcing the text to say something it doesn't. It is a pattern, and once you see it, Exodus stops being one story in the Bible. It becomes the shape hiding underneath the whole Bible. Here's the question this video answers. Why do totally unrelated figures across 1,000 years of scripture keep living out the same four-step story: exile, water, wilderness, arrival? And why did the biblical authors seem to think that was the point? Start with the shape itself, because you need to see it once, clearly, before you can see it everywhere else. In the book of Exodus, Israel is enslaved in a foreign land under a king who wants their children dead. That's the starting condition every later version of this pattern shares. Not just hardship, but a threat aimed specifically at the next generation, as if the danger is trying to make sure the story never continues. They are pulled out through water, the Red Sea splitting so they can walk through what should have killed them, with the same water then closing over the army chasing them. The crossing does double duty. An exit for Israel, a judgment on Egypt, in the same motion. Then they are driven into a wilderness, not around it, where they are tested for a fixed, symbolic length of time. 40 years. Long enough for an entire generation to die and a new one to be raised inside the testing itself. And at the end of that testing, they arrive not just at a location, but at a covenant. A new relationship with God, sealed at Sinai, that redefines who this people even is. Slavery, water, wilderness, covenant, 4 beats. Remember them because they are about to show up in places nobody warns you about. Roughly 700 years after the Exodus, a prophet named Elijah is introduced into the story of Israel's northern kingdom with almost no explanation. 1 Kings 17 simply drops him into the narrative already in motion. Sent east, away from the land, while a famine he himself announced starves the country he just left. Here's why that's strange before we even get to why it matters. Elijah doesn't repeat the Exodus mechanically, beat for beat. He compresses it. There's no Red Sea moment in this chapter, but there is the same deeper movement running underneath it. He's driven out by disaster, the way Jacob's sons were driven into Egypt by hunger generations earlier. In that exile, he doesn't starve. He's fed by ravens, and then by a widow, a Gentile widow, an outsider providing for God's prophet the way Egypt's fertile land of Goshen once provided for Israel while they were still foreigners there. The sustenance doesn't come from home. It comes from the very place the exile pushed him into. Then comes the moment that should stop you. The widow's son dies. Elijah raises him from death. A death followed by a restoration to life, sitting inside the same narrative arc that already echoes Israel's exile and provision story. And only after that does Elijah go back to confront the prophets of Baal, executing judgment the way Israel, once they'd crossed into Canaan, was tasked with confronting the false gods already there. Exile through disaster. Provision from an unexpected source. A death and life moment. A return to execute judgment. It's not a full replica of Exodus. It's a compressed echo of it, a prophetic remix using the same underlying movement in a shorter, tighter frame. And there's a reason this isn't a one-off reading. Years later, at the very end of Elijah's life, the text stops compressing and gives you the image directly. 2 Kings 2 has Elijah roll up his cloak and strike the Jordan River, and the water splits so he can cross on dry ground. The exact miracle from the Red Sea, replayed at the edge of his own story right before he's taken up and his ministry passes to Elisha. Here's the one-sentence version, the part worth remembering even if you forget everything else. Elijah spends his whole ministry inside a compressed version of Israel's Exodus, and right at the end, the text stops compressing and just gives you the parted water directly. There's a word for what's happening here, and it matters that you have it before we go further. Scholars call this typology. Not a hidden code and not a coincidence, but a recognized ancient practice of reading a new event through the shape of an older one, the way you might recognize a familiar melody, even when someone changes the key. It's different from prophecy, where someone predicts a specific future event in advance. Typology works backward and forward at once. The original event is real history on its own terms. and a later author can still pick up its shape on purpose to say, this is happening again. That distinction matters because nothing that follows in this video is a claim that ancient writers were hiding secret codes in the text. It's a claim that they were doing something they told you they were doing, in language plain enough to trace once you know to look for the 4 beats. If this is connecting dots you hadn't seen before, stay with me, because the pattern is about to stop being personal and start being national. If the Exodus shape only ever showed up once, in one prophet's story, you could file it away as a coincidence and move on. It doesn't stop there. About a century after Elijah, the pattern shows up again, not around one man this time, but around an entire captive nation. In the words of a prophet writing from inside the very disaster, the pattern was supposed to reverse. By 587 BC, Jerusalem has fallen. The temple is gone. The people who once escaped Egypt have become Egypt's prisoners again, only this time, the empire is Babylon. And this is exactly the moment a prophetic voice in Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 chooses to reach backward for the oldest rescue story Israel has, and reuse it almost word for word. Here's why that's strange. The passage opens with a voice crying out, "Prepare a highway in the wilderness for the Lord." Not a road to somewhere, a road out of Babylon through the desert toward home. Scholars studying this section have pointed out that this highway image deliberately echoes the very terrain Israel crossed the first time, centuries earlier, under Moses. And it's not a passing reference. This new Exodus language is placed at both the opening and the closing of this section of Isaiah. A literary frame scholars call an inclusio, meaning the entire prophecy is bookended by it on purpose. That's not decoration. That's structure. Then the language gets even more specific, and this is where it becomes hard to dismiss as accident. The prophet has God say, "I will make a way in the sea, a path through mighty waters," the same crossing described in almost the same words used for the Red Sea. A few chapters later comes a command that could be lifted straight out of the Exodus narrative. Go out from Babylon, flee from the Chaldeans, declare it with a shout of joy. The text even repeats water from a rock splitting open in the wilderness to give the people something to drink. The exact miracle from Israel's original wilderness years, replayed for a generation who never saw Egypt and never saw Moses. Water through the sea, a road through the wilderness, water from a rock a second time. This is Exodus's own vocabulary, deliberately recycled by a prophet speaking 600 years after the original crossing to describe a rescue that hadn't happened yet. Here's the sentence worth sending to someone. The prophet comforting Israel in exile didn't invent a new rescue story. He reached for the 600-year-old one already sitting in Israel's memory and told the exiles they were about to live it again. Notice what that does to the shape you're tracking. This isn't Israel once, then Elijah once. It's the same 4 beats appearing a third time, independently, in a completely different century, applied to a whole nation that had never walked through the Red Sea themselves. Scholars debate exactly how literally the returning exiles experienced this new exodus on the ground. Some argue the physical return from Babylon was more modest than the poetry describing it. But almost no one disputes that the prophet is intentionally building the promise out of Exodus's own architecture: captivity, a crossing, a wilderness, and an arrival that functions as covenant renewal. 3 separate moments in Israel's history: the original Exodus, one prophet's compressed ordeal, and an entire nation's public catastrophe, all narrated using the identical shape, and the shape still isn't finished. It shows up one more time, wrapped around a single infant, 7 centuries after Elijah and 150 years after the exiles left Babylon, in the most controversial use of this pattern in the entire Bible. In Matthew chapter 2, Joseph takes his family and flees to Egypt to escape King Herod, who is murdering children in an attempt to kill one specific child. When the family eventually returns, Matthew writes that this fulfilled what the prophet said, "Out of Egypt I called my son." He's quoting Hosea 11:1, and here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Hosea's line has no future tense in it at all. It's a memory. Hosea was looking backward at Israel, God's son, called out of Egypt centuries earlier under Moses. By the time Matthew was writing, that old national story had already become sacred memory, something every Jewish reader would recognize on sight. Hosea was not predicting anyone's birth. Scholars are explicit about this. It is not a verbal prophecy being fulfilled. It's something else entirely, a pattern being recognized and deliberately reapplied. Sit with what that means. Matthew takes a sentence about a nation's past and uses it to describe a baby's present. And he does it without apologizing for the switch, because in his world, that was allowed. It was expected. If a shape had already been laid down once by God, writers believed it could legitimately happen again, not as a copy, but as a completion. And once you know to look, the 4 beats don't stop at Egypt. Herod kills children the way Pharaoh once did. Jesus comes out of Egypt the way Israel did. He passes through water at his baptism, the way Israel passed through the Red Sea. He is driven into the wilderness for 40 days, echoing Israel's 40 years almost exactly. He is tested there, the way Israel was tested with hunger and doubt. And he feeds multitudes with bread that seems to fall from nowhere, the way manna once did in the desert. Herod's slaughter, Egypt, water, 40 in the wilderness, bread from heaven. The same 4 beats, the same order, in a completely different person, and Matthew is not hiding this. He's building it, sentence by sentence, expecting you to notice. Here's the sentence worth carrying out of this video. Israel's story, Elijah's compressed echo of it, and Jesus' story are not 3 unrelated events that happen to rhyme. They are the same shape worn by 3 different figures, because the biblical authors believed history itself repeats when God is the one writing it. Think about what that means for how you've been taught to read these stories. If the pattern is real, and the scholarship on Elijah's Jordan crossing on Isaiah's new Exodus language, and on Matthew's deliberate use of Hosea all says it is, then you were never supposed to read Exodus as a closed chapter. You were supposed to read it as a template. That changes a few things. It means the coincidences you've noticed in other Bible stories. A wilderness test, a crossing through water, a period of exile before a promise, might not be coincidences at all. They might be the same signal, placed on purpose by writers who expected their audience to catch it. Once you know the 4 beats, you start noticing candidates for them everywhere. Joseph's own exile into Egypt before Israel's exile ever happens. Jonah's 3 days in the deep before he's delivered onto dry land. The disciples caught on open water in a storm before Jesus calms it. Not every echo is equally certain. Some are stronger than others, and honest reading means holding the uncertain ones loosely. But the pattern gives you a lens for testing them, instead of just noticing scattered coincidences with no framework to explain them. It means the authors of Scripture were not simply recording history in the order it happened. Elijah's biographer, Isaiah's exilic prophet, and Matthew were all reading their own present moment through a much older story and asking their audience to recognize it too. That's a different way of reading than most people bring to these texts by default, treating each book as a standalone report rather than one installment in a much longer self-referencing conversation. It means a figure's suffering inside this framework was never presented as meaningless or random. It was presented as familiar, because familiarity is what let an ancient audience trust that the same God who acted at the Red Sea was still acting whether the setting was a famine in the northern hills, a river in Babylon, or a manger in Bethlehem. The 4 beats are, underneath everything else, a claim about consistency. That rescue has a recognizable shape, even when the person living through it has no idea they're inside a story anyone has seen before. And it means that if you ever find yourself in your own exile, your own water, your own wilderness stretch that seems to have no end date, the biblical writers built their entire library on the conviction that this isn't a sign you've fallen outside the pattern. By the logic Elijah, Isaiah, and Matthew are all using, the wilderness stage is not evidence the story has gone silent. It's usually the stage right before an arrival. Go back to that quote in Matthew, "Out of Egypt I called my son," a sentence written about a nation, borrowed for a boy, that only makes sense once you know it was never about prediction. It was about recognition. The writer looked at Egypt, at water, at 40 days in the wilderness, and said, "I have seen this shape before." That's the whole pattern in one line. It was never a repeating history. It was a repeating rescue, and Scripture kept dressing it in new names. Subscribe if you want the next hidden pattern before anyone points it out to you. And in the comments, one word is enough. Tell me, exile, water, wilderness, or arrival, which beat of the pattern are you in right now?